Okay, so today's topic is the introduction of the brain and spinal cord. And both these together are termed collectively as the central nervous system. Okay, this is C, central nervous system. In short, known as the CNS. Now, let us develop our concepts in a stepwise fashion. The stepwise means we would try to look back into the process of the development of the brain and spinal cord. Development bolte, what do I mean? I am specifying of the embryologic development. That is how we will understand the structure a bit better. So embryologic development means how in the embryo do the structures of the brain and the spinal cord develop. Okay. Embryo means bhrun. Bengali of embryo is bhrun. Okay. We know that the entire pregnancy continues till around the 9 months. And of that 9 months, the first 3 months, we specifically use the word embryo. From the 3rd month onwards, the more specific terms, fetus is now to be used. Clear? Now, while this embryo is developing, since brain and the spinal cord is supposed to control and coordinate every functions of our body, I think I've already explained this in one of my classes, that the principal function of the brain is to control and coordinate all the different functions. So this control center or the coordination center might need to develop at the very beginning so that it can start its activity or function of controlling and coordinating as other organs in the embryo develop. Other organs in the embryo develop করার আগেই বা খুব early stage brain and spinal cord starts developing. Now, how does it start, or which structure gives rise to the formation of the brain and the spinal cord? The structure is a kind of a tube, and we call this tube as neural tube. নিউরাল টিউব কি করে তৈরি হয়, কোন স্ট্রাকচারের থেকে নিউরাল টিউব তৈরি হয়, সেই জায়গাটা এই কারেন্ট ডিসকাশনে ইজ নট দ্যাট মেটেরিয়াল. ওকে, বাট the concept of a tube, what is a tube? Tube is a hollow thing, right? Tube is a hollow that is surrounded by a solid wall. তাই তো হয়? If you see any tube, if you see the pipes, the water pipes or whatever, you see a kind of cylindrical structure, at a lomba cylindrical structure dekha jay. And in that lomba cylindrical structure, what we get is a hollowness inside that structure. Right? Are you getting what I'm trying to say? The neural tube.
Yes, sir.
Now what happens? I mean, in this hollow cylindrical structure, the wall, I mean, I will zoom it out. I will increase it and will show you that the hollow space is surrounded by a thick wall. That this hollow space is surrounded by a thick wall. So this entire, darkened out areas represents the wall of the hollow tubes. So it represents what? The wall of the hollow tube. What does it signify actually? It signifies that what we consider the brain to be a solid organ, in reality, it is not a solid organ. It is but rather a hollow organ. The brain is not only the brain, even the spinal cord, both are hollow, papa organ. Did you understand now? Can you hollow organ bolchi? Why am I calling this as a hollow organ? Because inside the brain, whatever is present is a fluid. And that fluid is known as cerebrospinal fluid in short. Also, we call this a CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. Now, for the medical laboratory technology profession, this fluid is very important. We must know the normal composition of this fluid, as because we need to detect now and then in the laboratory the abnormal constitutions of the cerebrospinal fluid. I mean, there is a process called spinal tap, or we can also call that as a lumbar puncture. In this process, what happens? The cerebrospinal fluid is collected, right? How is it collected is a different topic that I will cover up on in some other class. That is though not necessary for the first semester, but that will get covered on some other class. But just a very basic anatomical perspective is what that I would like to cover in today's class. What is that? If I consider that this neural tube is where from the brain and the spinal cord develop, surrounding the neural tube are which structures? These structures are repetitive structures, and these structures are the individual vertebrae of the vertebral column. Try to recall, I said that the spinal cord is protected inside the vertebral column. If you take individual vertebrae, if this be the individual vertebrae, this is the solid part, and there is an arch where there is a hollow, right? And into this hollow is this blue colored spinal cord present. Now, if you place successively one vertebrae after the next, thereafter another vertebrae. So you are placing the vertebrae one after another, forming a series of vertebrae. The result is that this arch would also form a series of hollow spaces. And that series of hollow spaces would form the canal. That canal would contain this neural tube as is shown in the diagram. Did you understand? So the outside of the neural tube is again in a hollow space. The space within this vertebral arch. And the inside of the neural tube is again a hollow. Containing what? Containing the cerebrospinal fluid. Clear? Now, the cerebrospinal fluid, it is true that it is present inside this neural tube. That means inside the brain and the spinal cord. But that is not entirely true, because this CSF is also present outside the neural tube. Confused a bit? So let me explain again. The fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, is present both inside the neural tube as well as is also present on the outside of the neural tube. Thus, it is a kind of a medium into which the entire central nervous system is immersed. বাংলা একটা কথা আছে না, চোবানো? জলের মধ্যে চুবিয়ে রাখলে কি হয়? Things would float. তাই তো? Similarly, we can say that this entire neural tube and its derivatives are floating in a sea, CSF er sea, সমুদ্র, CSF দিয়ে তৈরি করা একটা সমুদ্রের মধ্যে নিউরাল টিউবটা রয়েছে। And this is having definite advantages. What is that advantage? Let me explain. The brain that is inside the skull is a soft organ. It's a very soft organ, actually. Okay, mathar ghilu, you can say it as in the Bengali, the very layman's term. Mathar ghilu. So that's a very soft organ. And what about the skull? The skull is this skull soft or hard? It is made up of bones. So would it be soft or would it be hard?
Hard.
Hard. Now imagine a situation in which, suppose say, if my fingers and the thumbs are representing the skull, which is hard, and inside this hard cavity there is the soft organ. If this fist represents the soft organ, the brain is present inside the cranial cavity, and the cranial cavity is bound on all around, on all the sides by hard bony structures. That's a result of when, say, for example, the skull is moving, and along with that, the soft brain would also move, and there are definite chances that the soft brain would strike the inner hard walls of the skull cavity. Right? Okay. I can give you an analogy. What is that?
Sir.
If I take a container and place a ball inside the container. So if this be the ball inside the container. So as you shake the container, what happens to this ball? The ball strikes against the inner walls of this container. Quite natural. And if you shake it violently, in that case, what will happen? The ball might undergo a damage. Right? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Now, if I pour some amount of liquid, if these green dots are representing the liquids present outside the ball, but inside the container. In that case, is there any chance of the ball striking hard against the inner walls of the cranial cavity? Is it possible that way? Did you understand the question? I think you haven't. Let me repeat them. In that same arrangement of a ball inside the container, I am now pouring liquid. So the liquid is now to occupy outside the ball, as shown in the form of a dots, but inside the container. Container bhetore kintu ball bayre jodi kono liquid is placed. In that case, would the ball strike hard against the inner walls of the container? Tateo ki ball ta dhakka khabe?
No, sir.
Exactly.
No, sir.
Similarly, our skull is that container which is having an inner wall. The skull cavity is having the walls bounded by the bones, right? And that is a solid thing. And inside the skull is the brain. I will show you how it's present inside the brain. What are the shapes of it? What are the different poles, lobes? I will come to that. But first, get this concept that being inside the skull and being a soft organ present inside the skull, chances are high that when we will move our head this way very violently, in whatever directions, up and down or sideways, whatever direction it be, then like that ball on the screen, the brain should strike against the inner walls of the cranial cavity, and there is chances that it will suffer a damage. But it doesn't suffer the damage. No, why? Because these green dot fluids are present, and that green dot fluid in the brain is known as what? It is known as the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. Did you understand how cerebrospinal fluid contributes to something called buoyancy? Okay, so this concept is known as buoyancy. So with the help of this buoyancy, what happens? It is acting as a kind of protection to the brain. Now, being this fluid present inside the ball, that means if the walls of this ball be a very thick, then the inner walls naturally would suffer from a kind of shortage of the nutrients materials. If you haven't understood this concept, let me draw another thing separately. What I'm trying to say is, consider now a very thick ball. So if the ball be this much of, so this is the thickness of the ball, where on that area I'm putting this cross signs. If this be the thickness of, now outside this thickness, we are having the CSF. The CSF being fluid, it definitely thus can carry the different nutrients, trophic factors, hormones, oxygen. But if the ball be having the walls of sufficient thickness, of this thickness, then is it possible to the nutrients to gain access to the inner aspects of this ball? I mean, there are multiple layers. So this I can consider as the inner layer of the ball. Accordingly, this should be considered as the outer layer of the ball. Now, the inner layer would definitely run under shortage of nutrients, oxygen, trophic factors, because most of the thing will be absorbed by the cells present in the outer layer, right? Joto thick hobe, joto mota hobe, toto to fluid cannot penetrate. Are you understanding the point? Okay. So this problem is resolved. This problem is thus resolved. Thank you for the contribution. This problem is thus resolved if the same fluid remains present even to the inside. So if the same fluid is present both the inside as well as the outside, then the inners and the outer layers of the ball, now we would use the word brain and the spinal cord, because the brain and the spinal cord are also hollow structures that we have just taken note of. They are also hollow structures. And whatever the structures that we see of the brain are basically wall developments. I would now write this particular specific term. These are the wall developments. আমরা ব্রেনের যত বলি যে এর এত বুদ্ধি ওর তত কম বুদ্ধি, ব্রেনের গ্রে ম্যাটার বা ব্রেনের হোয়াইট ম্যাটার, এই যে ম্যাটার্স অফ দ্য ব্রেন আর বেসিক্যালি দ্য ডেভেলপমেন্টস অফ wall. Wall of what? Wall of the neural tube, যেটা আমি ক্লাসে শেষে বলেছি, and it is also in this particular diagram just beside it. Understood? The role of CSF. So the role of CSF is in one place protecting the brain and the spinal cord against different kinds of injuries that this soft organs can suffer on movement of this or of the bony parts. So the head can move, the skull can move, and also the vertebral column can move. So we can have forward bending, backward bending, sideways bending. So with all these bends, it is the entire vertebral column that is moving. And that movement of the vertebral column can cause injury, can cause damage to the spinal cord, which is a soft organ. Now, in between the spinal cord or the brain and the outer protective bony covering, there is the layer of fluid, and that layer of fluid is, here is the CSF fluid. So in that way, CSF is trying to protect. In another way, CSF is also promoting to the survival. How? By supplying the different trophic factors, oxygen, nutrients, hormones, any other things that is required. Even sometimes drugs are required. That means the medications are required. For a disease of a brain, we do also need to administer orally medications, because brain, you know, it is all around protected by solid thing, that's the cranial object. So you would not be able to inject any medicine directly into the brain. It is not possible. And there is another reason of this being impossible. I will explain to that later on in this today's class itself. So there is no way of injecting any kind of medicines into our brain. So whatever medicines that we need to have acting upon the brain, all those medicines must go through what? Through the blood. But in between the blood and the tissues of the brain, there is another fluid, and that fluid is the CSF fluid. So CSF should be carrying whatever nutrients or whatever medications are required by the brain. Are you understanding the concept now? So that is the importance of CSF. And for the laboratory technology profession, CSF is a very vital, biological sample that we need to analyze so as to find out definitive disorders, either in the brain or in the spinal cord, or in some cases, both. Is the concept now clear?
Yes, sir.
So next, if we have to look into, thank you for the confirmation. Next, if we have to look into, we will now look into this part, the wall developments. So if I draw that same neural tube again, suppose this is the neural tube. Whatever I have drawn is the hollow part. That hollow part is surrounded by the thick neural tube. Now, the walls of the neural tube are variously developed. So in some areas, the walls are hugely developed. In other areas, the development is very narrow. In other some areas, there are even a bit more development. So there are different forms of development of the walls of the neural tube. And based on these different forms of development, we now have the different regions and the structures of the brain defined and named. Understood? So very roughly, because this current session is not having much more time left, only 3 minutes, 42 seconds. If I draw the brain in a very rough format, so this would look something like this. So you probably have heard of the word called, in Bengali, you call this as a Guru Mostishko, Laghu Mostishko. So these are the words that you have probably heard of in Bengali. Now, these Guru and the Laghu are referring to the divisions of the structure of the brain. So this is a very rough diagram. Do not consider this as a very accurate one. What I would say is that if we get this diagram on the top, what it represents is the brain. So brain is present on the top, okay? And usually there are, very apparent 2 different segments of this brain, grossly. So there's very apparent 2 different segments of the brain. One is known as the cerebrum. I will give you more details about cerebrum. And the other one is known as cerebellum. You do not always need to write as you attend this lecture. You can write it of your own, but obviously that will be uploaded. Okay, so you can replay the videos as many number of times. Now, see, cerebellum is thus present towards the back side. Now, you might have questions. How do you come to know which one is the front side or which one is the back side? Consider that the cerebellum is on the front side. And the topmost part is projected more anteriorly on the front side. So the topmost part is what? The cerebrum, and the cerebrum is projected more anteriorly, is projected more towards the anterior direction. So this is the anterior or the front side. Understood? Now, just opposite to the cerebellum, we have another wall development out here. And these are to be termed as, something called, you can call it as of now the brain stem. Okay, it is having, I can show you 2 parts of this brain stem very clearly in this diagram. One is the relatively more swollen part, and that part is known as the pons. The entire word of, this is a very vital organ, pons. Okay, I will tell you why is this a very vital organ in the next session. And just below the pons, we are having this relatively, narrowed out area that is known as medulla. medulla. Okay, medulla. The full name is medulla oblongata. OBLONGATL. I'm not going to write the names right here, but on the next session, definitely, because just less than a minute is left. Join me in the next session and I will stop the recording. You have to join me after a minimum of say 5 minutes, because this recording would take 5 minutes of time to process itself. Okay. So now go through the screen, find out whatever more doubts you have. You can go through as many number of times once this entire class record gets posted into the channel.